Hello, everybody, and welcome. Gonna ask our ops people to work on making sure we've got the appropriate people spotlighted so the interpreters can see and be seen. Um, but while we're doing that, I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Justin Flores with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, and PESP released a report in August on the video relay service or the VRS industry, which was eye-opening for me and has led to a commitment from PESP to continue to research and write on these issues and support interpreters and VRS users advocacy, which brings us to this webinar today aimed at educating the public on this important effort. And today we're going to talk about a little known but very important program, which is dominated by two private equity owned companies, Sorenson and ZP Better Together. Sorenson is owned by Ariel Alternatives and Blackstone, while ZP Better Together is owned by Kinderhook and Carlyle's subsidiary Alpinvest. And so we have some amazing speakers who will dive deeper into the efforts of VRS users and interpreters to build a union and a better service for users. Throughout the webinar, there's a Q&A feature that you can use, and we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, but we'll reserve those for the end. So before we get started, I'm going to introduce our great panelists first. Dr. Shaelyn O'Riordan is a fourth-generation deaf woman born hearing to a deaf family who later became deaf. She's been a deaf interpreter in the medical and legal fields since 2010. Dr. Shea graduated most recently in 2016 with a PhD in metaphysics. She also holds a PhD in health sciences and a doctorate in pharmacology. Growing up, Dr. Shea acquired ASL from age 6 months onward, learning and incorporating tactile ASL from her great-grandmother, as well as Iroquois Sign Language. We also have joining us Meg Huseman, who's been a certified ASL interpreter for the last 15 years and has a dual state certification and specializes in language deprivation interpreting. She works for Sorenson and is a member of the ASL Interpreters Union and a mother of a 10-year-old daughter who is deaf plus. Fiona Ma was elected to California's 34th state treasurer in 2018, with more votes than any other candidate for treasurer in the state's history. She's the first woman of color and the first woman CPA elected to the position. As treasurer, she sits on the board of the California Public Employee Retirement System, CalPERS, and the California State Teachers Retirement System, CalSTRS. And Treasurer Ma has been an outspoken advocate for responsible investing, including ensuring that labor practices are part of the evaluation of investment risk to ensure good returns on state investments and to avoid the use of public funds to violate workers' rights. Finally, Joe Klug is a VRS interpreter who was laid off from ZP Better Together earlier this year when the company shut down a busy call center in Minnesota after interpreters there began organizing a union. He now works for Sorenson as a member of the ASL Interpreters Union, seeking a union contract to improve working conditions and a better VRS service for users. I'd also like to thank our hardworking interpreters in advance, Matt Salerno and Kevin Jones-Eastland, for making sure everyone can speak and hear from each other on this important issue. So my first question will be for Dr. Shea. It's both simple but very important. Can you tell us what is VRS and why is it such an important service? Kevin, I think we're having trouble hearing you.
How about now?
Now it's good.
So VRS is a phone system for the deaf. So we can use that system to make appointments, to meet coworkers online, for example, during Zoom meetings, for work, to basically call 911, So, just whatever anyone would use a phone for, that's what that system is in place for deaf and hard of hearing users. I use VRS every day to meet with clients online, to take Zoom calls. It's very important for deaf people to have that sort of access so that we could take meetings for work, so that we can, maybe call our lawyer or make a medical appointment or have discussions with family or friends, order food, all kinds of things.
Great, thank you, Dr. Shea. Our next speaker is Meg Huseman. And given your 15 years of experience in the field, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do and what led you to become active in the effort to organize your workplace?
Absolutely. I want to thank everyone for joining this call today. My industry, the VRS industry, is harming my community and, more importantly, my family. 10 years ago, I joined Sorenson, and back then, if you joined Sorenson, you were at the top. You'd made it. Unfortunately, in the last several years, Sorenson has abandoned the deaf community and its employees with its profit over people approach. Last year, I witnessed my company lay off quite a few of their biggest assets. Middle management. My boss, who is a deaf interpreter and had been with the company since it opened, was not spared. The current middle management that replaced the older middle management is not qualified or equipped to support my needs as an interpreter. There have also been numerous changes that impact interpreters negatively, such as being reprimanded if your login rate shows too many requests for another interpreter to join the call for support. I'd like to give you an example of what a typical shift looks like. So my first call might be a doctor's office, pretty routine stuff. Then I might get a call for a parent-teacher conference. Again, not a huge deal. After that, I might get a call from a mechanic shop talking about the car, maybe the sway bar needs replaced or the struts need replaced. Next, I'd get a call to the bank. Maybe we're making some kind of payment, or we're talking about our account or changes that need to happen. Then I hear the all too familiar ding of a 911 call. I might be witnessing an accident where the deaf person is calling from their cell phone, and I can see that they are bleeding, in shock, or panicking, and they are trying to get help as quickly as possible. I do my job, services arrive, they're rushed off to the hospital or wherever they're going. I hang up the phone, and if it's not time for my break, I have to take another call immediately after witnessing this traumatic event. Can you imagine the knowledge base needed to facilitate communication across so many different topics and the potential for vicarious trauma at my job? If I log off, I'm reprimanded. If I have tech issues that can't be resolved within the hour, I'm not paid for the rest of my shift. If I call a team too many times in 1 week, I'm reprimanded. How can I do my job effectively without the support that I need? Next, I want to really paint a picture of what my family experiences as consumers of Sorenson and what myself and my colleagues experience as employees of Sorenson. With my current skill level, I can interpret roughly 85 to 90% of information accurately with a 5% margin of error and 10% of things that just don't translate from one language to another. On average, a newly hired interpreter can convey accurately 40 to 60% of that same information. How do those statistics apply to today's conversation? Well, When my daughter, as a consumer of VRS, does not have equitable access to communication with Sorensen, she doesn't have access to the outside world. She's not calling the bank or the mechanic. She's calling her grandmother to talk about superfluous things that have happened during her day. When she gets an interpreter, there's a potential for multiple errors and misunderstandings. This is incredibly frustrating for my daughter and my grandmother. To make up for burning out so many seasoned and highly skilled interpreters, Sorensen is pushing new interpreters through the door without proper training and throwing them into situations they're not prepared for. Sorensen is treating interpreters like they are disposable and just warm bodies to put in front of the phones. I want to make it very clear that I support all of my colleagues, regardless of how many years of experience they have. Sorensen has a responsibility to train us. They have the ability to train us, and they refuse to fund the resources necessary for us to do our jobs. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. Our resources have dwindled. I'm not saying that Sorensen should not make a profit. They should absolutely make a profit, but they're making a killing. Sorensen earns $360 an hour per interpreter. I earn $40 of that $360. So if they have 50 interpreters working on the phones in a 1 hour time frame, they earn $18,000. It has been my experience in the past 2 years that Sorensen's predatory practices have harmed the interpreting community and the deaf community. It is Sorensen's responsibility to the deaf community to provide highly skilled, effective interpreters. It is Sorensen's responsibility to interpreters they employ to provide appropriate support, professional development, mentoring opportunities, vicarious trauma intervention, higher pay, and more deaf leadership within the company. I support a union because without one, Sorensen will continue to harm the community and my family.
Thank you, Meg, for sharing that and for your work advocating for both the deaf community and for your fellow interpreters. We've shared the link to the union's website in the chat for folks who want to check that out. Next, I'd like to go to Treasurer Mom. You have significant experience navigating the process of responsible investing that generates returns for two of the most important pension systems in the country. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in this role and your efforts to ensure that treatment of workers is taken into account as a risk when making investments?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Justin. And some of you may not know, but I attended this Rochester Institute of Technology for my undergrad, specializing in accounting. But my job for 4 years was working in the interpreter training office at NTID, the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. And I had one tennis partner who was completely deaf. And that was a real interesting experience because when you're playing doubles, you need to communicate with yourself, with each other. And sometimes I would say, I got it. And she'd still go after it. Or she would think I got it and then turn around and I thought she had it. So she was great, Mary Jean Shaheen, and taught me a lot about what it's like to be deaf, and also not only playing tennis as a partner, as a doubles partner, but she used to also drive and take me around. And because she could not hear, she had to look at me whenever I would speak. And so half the time she was looking at me, half the time she was looking at the road, and it was a very scary experience. But she had a great sense of humor and just an amazing person. So that's kind of another interest of why I am here today. And thank you, Justin, for bringing us all together and letting us know what is happening at these companies. I definitely, my team and I know Frank Rufino is on, Lori Matson, as well as my chief deputy, Patrick Henning, and two of my external affairs members, Kat Weir, as well as Christian Daly. They're all on this call because it's important that these companies are held accountable in terms of what they are, who they are hiring, what services they are providing. And in this instance, we did not know, or I did not know much about these two companies that own the interpreter training and interpreter services companies. So we stand by you, behind you, we support you, especially if you have a disability. We should be doing everything to accommodate so that whether you're hearing impaired or sight impaired, you should also be getting all of the information accurately, timely, and efficiently. So I just thank Justin for inviting us on so that we can be educated, and then we can advocate for all of you.
Thank you, Treasurer Mom. Really appreciate you being here with us today and all of the work you've done to ensure that people recognize that what's good for workers is almost always what's good for the viability of companies and protecting pension fund investments.
Oh, I have one more question.
Sure.
Are TTYs still being used, or is a VRS the new TTY? Like fax machines are no longer really around.
I will defer to Dr. Shea or Meg if you want to answer that question as our two experts on these issues.
This is Dr. Shea. Yeah, I can answer that. TTYs are a thing of the past. Back in the 90s, we stopped using those way back when. And personally, I have never had the experience of using the TTY. I'm also speaking from the experience of being a person who's 41. So yeah,
Okay,
we
so
don't use TTYs.
you can tell how old I am. You can tell how old I am.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, TTYs are definitely a thing of the past. That's an outdated technology. As soon as texting came along, that became something that took over, and we definitely see a lot of signers who use the relay service. So that's been the primary way of communicating over the phone for the last 15-20 years. So the last couple of decades, we've relied on the services of the video relay industry.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shea.
You're very
Yes.
welcome.
Thanks for that. And Dr. Shea, thanks for that additional information. And I want to go back to you, Dr. Shea, if you could share with us, earlier you explained what VRS is and why it's important. And hoping you could talk a little bit more about why you've become active in supporting the ASL Interpreters Union and what changes to the current system you're hoping to see through this process.
Certainly. Yeah. VRS is a major part of my entire life, and it hits every area of it. I'm a daily user of the service, and interpreters who are not able to interpret effectively have a great impact on our lives. If there's an interpreter who may come to work having a bad day, or an interpreter who just had a hard call, maybe like Meg was saying, they just hung up a 911 call and then they have to join me on a Zoom meeting. Maybe they're not in the right state of mind to take my call. They may not be prepared for what's to come. So the constant dependence that I have on VRS is directly impacted by where the interpreter's mindset's at. The big thing that I would like to resolve is a little bit about what happens in my life as a user of the industry. So the story that I'd like to share comes from, well, actually I have two stories that I'd like to share. So one happened just yesterday. I called in to court and I'm in the middle of a proceeding. And I am there advocating for someone in a particular situation. And so I was on the call with them, and the interpreter that we used was through VRS. But unfortunately, they didn't even understand the simplest of terms that I was saying. The term that I was using is, very basic, plaintiff, right? In the legal system, we hear plaintiff very regularly, and we hear another term, defendant, very regularly too in the system. But the interpreter was not familiar with those two words, plaintiff or defendant, and they didn't know the signs for them. But these are basic legal terms that I'm used to hearing. So they were not willing to understand or work with me, and they actually ended the call of their own accord because they didn't understand me. So they hung up on me. And this was now a waste of time because I had to then go about requesting a new interpreter for the call. They refused to transfer the call out and find someone else. And here I was trying to find an interpreter that was able to understand some of this basic terminology to help this person in a court proceeding, but they were not able to understand me and they were not able to honor my request to find someone else. I ended up ending the call entirely and I switched over to another interpreter, but I had to wait a while for the interpreter to be available. That interpreter also didn't understand me. So when I went to the courthouse, I used a video remote interpreting platform, which meant that I was in the actual courthouse and trying to use an interpreter virtually. But this was now the third interpreter that I was trying to use for the same client. This was also just to mail something, pretty basic ask. So I've had 3 interpreters at this point now trying to interpret for me, mailing something through the court system. So there are clear gaps that interpreters need to be trained up on, and we need interpreters who are qualified, who have experience working in these settings, like in a legal system, but we don't have interpreters with the right credentials and backgrounds. There are very few interpreters who do have the breadth of legal knowledge, and there are even fewer interpreters who are trained on interpreting in these settings. But we need to think about recruiting interpreters who have these specialty areas to work effectively for people like me who are trying to navigate these systems. We need interpreters who have basic knowledge and training in order to interpret effectively for us. And it doesn't just come down to training, but we also have to think about things like work conditions. Interpreters often don't get breaks on the job. I try to make a call and I can see visually that the interpreter is exhausted. They're having a hard time. And I'll even ask them, have you taken your break? Do you need a minute? Maybe this interpreter does need a minute because they just got off of a really hard call, or maybe they're tired, or maybe they're upset because of the last call. Something may have happened to them, or maybe it's from their personal lives. So as deaf community members, we deserve better access to the phone. We all use the phone regularly to connect with other people on a daily basis. I can't imagine what would happen if I wasn't able to find an interpreter who could interpret for me. I worry that the interpreter won't understand me, or they won't know what I need, or if the interpreter and I aren't a good fit. We have to think about things like that. And we need to have interpreters who are qualified to do the job. There are some interpreters who need to work with deaf interpreters and certified deaf interpreters. They're another big piece of the puzzle. And you may not be familiar with deaf interpreters, but they're an essential part of linguistic access and understanding intent of speakers and conveying meaning effectively. Hearing interpreters may not be able to follow along, and so we use the skills of deaf interpreters to ensure that communication is effectively relayed. For instance, like Meg was saying about emergency calls, when 911 calls come in, I advocate for having a deaf interpreter as a part of the process 100% of the time. If an emergency call is placed, it's because of an emergency. Maybe the caller is having a stroke. Maybe maybe the hearing interpreter isn't able to follow along because of the state of mind that the deaf caller is in. Having a deaf interpreter there brings in a linguistic and cultural understanding that the hearing interpreter may not be able to reflect. That way, we can ensure that they are effectively represented in the call. It's not a want, it's a need. It's not a nice to have. It's an essential part of the service, and we need to do better about educating people about the function of deaf interpreters in the process. We also need to improve the technological standards that we're operating under. They're currently abhorrent. We have tons of issues regularly in maintaining connectivity, and the service has not been updated at all. Sometimes I'll be on a Zoom meeting and I'll use the VRS interpreter to interpret what's happening in the Zoom meeting, but their screen is so pixelated, I won't be able to see them, or vice versa. They may not be able to see me well because of their connectivity. So then they hang up on me, or I hang up on them, and then I have to wait to find someone else and hope that they have a better connection than the one before them. So these kinds of barriers in terms of technology are very easy to work through. They're insufficiently operating currently. And when we talk about quality of service, it also comes down to quality of technology. The existing technology that we have is rife with problems, and we can do better to provide more updated technology to interpreters and to deaf callers. So these are some areas that I'd love to see improved through these efforts. We need to have qualified interpreters. We need to ensure the use of deaf interpreters and certified deaf interpreters for linguistic intent. It's a critical part of the service that is missing. And finally, we do need to improve the technology that's being used, because currently the funding that goes to Sorensen and the ZP is not being allocated to improve technology. So without good technology, we're not able to access this kind of service appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shea. I saw, Meg, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in and add something?
Yes, I just wanted to piggyback on what Dr. Shea said about having deaf interpreters. That is something that Sorensen employees have directly asked for multiple times, and we have been given a flat out no as of less than a month ago. I asked if deaf interpreters would be hired to team with us and work with us on the very issues that Dr. Shea mentioned, and it was a hard no, because Sorensen does not want to cut into their own profit to hire deaf interpreters.
Thanks for adding that, Meg. I think both your comments and Dr. Shea's comments remind us that how intertwined interpreters' working conditions and really in many types of jobs, the working conditions are correlated with quality of service. And a reminder that in oftentimes with the private equity model of buying companies and trying very quickly to increase profits and profitability, both workers and quality can suffer. So I definitely appreciate your comments. I also want to add that being there may be a generational gap. Somebody joining us posted in the Q&A period to say that TTY machines are still used by older deaf folks, and that they are supported and still required by the FCC. Though the more modern technology is VRS, some people still are using TTY. So thanks for that. Wanted to make sure that was also heard. Up next, we're going to hear from Joe Klug. I want to thank you for bearing through some technical difficulties and being able to join us today. You've had some experience in trying to advocate for a better VRS program, and I'm hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your experience and the situation you faced earlier this year.
Yeah, so I initially worked with Purple Z VRS, and I had started talking with some of my colleagues about establishing a union. It was just going to be within our location of St. Paul. And we were starting to get very little progress on it, but we were going to be meeting with some union reps to try and figure out what that process would look like of getting everything set up. The reason that we wanted to get it done is there were a lot of different things that we were noticing within our system. Our admin was really disconnected. They didn't understand who we were as interpreters and what we needed. Luckily, we had a center manager that really advocated for us, but there's only so much that she was able to do. We were noticing that a lot of the new interpreters who were coming in were given a really high raise. When I started, I was a new interpreter. I had less than 2 years of experience and I didn't have any certification. But as I came in, I was talking to people and I already was getting more money than people who had been there for 2 or 3 years. They had certification and they had shown that they were a really good employee. One of the things that we do often is we are able to give kudos to people who are exceptional workers, are really good to team with, and take control of a situation when it gets hard to manage. And we had people who were getting compliments from their peers on a daily basis. Every time that they were working, they were getting something that showed that they are a really good interpreter. But still, they were making less than someone that had very little interpreting experience at all and was just coming in. So that was one of the things that we noticed. We tried to advocate for them to get raises, and they would always try and go to management, but they weren't able to get that to work out. They were always given some sort of answer that would be like, oh yeah, this is something that we can work on, or once you get certification or another level of certification, then we can talk about it. But if you've been there for years and you have shown that you do good work, your peers are acknowledging that you do good work, that should be a reason to get a raise. If you've been there for 2 years, there should be reasons for you to get a raise. So that's just one of the reasons that we were thinking that this would be something that would benefit us to have a union. So one of our leads started to get that in the works, and we had a meeting set. We had a date ready for it. And I was working I'm from Minneapolis. I was working north of the Twin Cities area. And on my drive back, that person who was in lead called me and told me that there was an emergency meeting that Z Purple was going to be setting up for our center. I pulled off at a near stop and I hopped on this call to see what was going on, to figure out that we were all going to be laid off. I'm young. I still have a lot to do in this field. I still have a lot to gain. So the impact that it had on me wasn't as severe as it was for some of the other people. I'm still flexible. I can still work in freelance settings. I can get into a new area. But we had people who had been working for Z since it was a company called CSD. It's been around for 20 years. They've been doing full-time work at this location for a long time. And they depended on this. This was something that they were planning on using for the next few years until they were able to retire. Or in some cases, we had people that were in 6 months going to be retiring. I had a friend that had just been promised to get full-time work and just quit his job so he could come in and work full-time at Purple. And then we were given a last-minute notice that we were going to be closing. We have a very large center of interpreters here in Minnesota. And we had, at any day of the business week, 15 people working. So that is a really large group of interpreters to just lay off. Purple is known by interpreters for having really long queues of deaf people waiting to get on calls and get an interpreter. There were times where I would see that we had 100 people waiting to connect with an interpreter. I can't imagine how long that wait would be. Imagine trying to get on a call and just call over to your parents, call over to a loved one, and having to wait multiple minutes to connect with an interpreter just so you can make a call to tell someone some exciting news. Like, that's crazy. So to get rid of a large center that has people who are dependable, happy to work there, showed that they were good employees, and decide that you didn't need them anymore, to me feels crazy. When I got on the call, I just felt rage at that situation, knowing that I had so many of my colleagues that were being laid off. And when we asked for reasons, they just said that they had business reasons that they had to consider. I don't know what those reasons were. We asked if we could get clarification. They wouldn't give us clarification. We asked what sort of reasons, what sort of decision-making process went behind this, and they said that they would get back to us, which they never did. This is the kind of thing that we see when you aren't focused on your consumers or your employees. If you're focused on the profits and you're just focused on having a product that makes as much money as possible, we see that Purple has a worse product, a product that people aren't going to want to use. And this is one of the issues that we're seeing right now with Sorensen, is that we are seeing that there are more decisions that are being made that aren't for helping interpreters or helping their consumers and the deaf community. And so there's this real concern that there's a possibility that Sorensen might follow this path that Purple is on and start having a worse product and having longer wait times for deaf people. Now that I'm working with Sorensen, I want to continue this. I want to continue having a union for all VRS interpreters because it makes our job more manageable. If I am working an hour as an interpreter and I have call after call after call, they get really frustrating. We see a lot of oppression in our field on the deaf community, and we can try and advocate as much as we can, but a lot of times our role is really not there to be an advocate. We are there to facilitate communication between the caller and the hearing people, and we can try and educate and we can try and add that in, but that's also a really big mental demand when we are trying to just get this basic call taken care of. And as Dr. Shea has mentioned before, there's some really serious calls that happen. There are some calls that are very intimate one-on-one calls with family and friends, but then you have those calls where it is a mental health situation, a 911 situation. And when I'm told that I have 10 minutes for a break every hour that I work, sometimes as an interpreter, I feel like I need to just keep going through it. That call wasn't that bad. You know, I can go through another one. It'll be okay. But, you know, for me, I might think that I'm doing okay, but my deaf consumer recognizes that I need a break, that I'm looking tired, that I've done too much today already. So these are just some of the things that we notice. And it's constant. We talk about it a lot as interpreters. But it's one of those things that if we were to have a union and we were able to advocate for ourselves, advocate for the deaf community for a better quality product, we would be able to provide that. We have solutions ready for it.
Well, thanks, Joe, for sharing that. It does sound like you were never given a good reason for the closure, and it was coinciding with the union organizing effort. And I'm sure that the company was happy to just say business reasons, but it does sound very strange that here we are months later and you're still not sure why that place was closed. So thank you for your work to continue to advocate for interpreters and for deaf users. Yeah, we'll probably have some questions for you here at the end. I did, want to, as you can see from the speakers here, I didn't want to dive too deep into the PESP report on the VRS system, but really thought it was, much more valuable for the public to hear directly from folks who do the work and who use the system. And so I hope that people will read the report and dig in a little bit more on some of these issues. I do want to flag one thing that might be important to just step back and recognize that this VRS system, is put in place through federal regulations to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so the whole VRS industry is overseen by the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, that promulgates rules that both regulate the industry and decide what rates will be used to reimburse these VRS companies on a per minute basis, as Meg mentioned. And so it's important to recognize in October 2023 that the FCC raised the amount of their per minute reimbursement rates to these VRS companies like Sorensen and CP by 30 to 49%. And one of the things that we found as we did this report to be both interesting and really concerning is that the one reason for the large rate increase in the amounts paid to ZP and Sorensen and VRS users was a recognition that there is a lack of ASL interpreters. There's a shortage that I think even the companies were saying publicly that wages and benefits needed to be increased in order to improve retention and deal with these issues. And so that FCC regulation actually states that they expect wages and benefits to increase by 65% over 5 years. And here we are 2 years later, post rate increase. And what we're hearing is that interpreters are not seeing across the board increases that would come anywhere near a 65% increase over 5 years. So these same regulations that say that they expect this 65% wage increase to happen, also allow for VRS providers to come back to the FCC. And if they show that, in fact, they needed to increase wages even more, that the FCC could then go back and reevaluate whether they need to raise rates again. But it also says that if these wages are not increased accordingly, that they might reevaluate and take other steps, including lowering the rate. And so, this both presents an opportunity for the VRS providers to work with their employees to raise wages and hopefully, be able to do that without sacrificing the integrity of the business. But it also creates a risk where, we may see a decrease in reimbursement rates if these wages are not increased as they're supposed to be. And such an action would really create serious risk for the viability of these companies and also for their investors. So, this is really, I think, important context that, this is all happening in a federally regulated industry. And it means that in addition to VRS providers and their private equity owners, that the FCC should also play a key role in ensuring that the VRS system is not further harmed by low wages and poor working conditions that can make an interpreter shortage even worse. So with all this very important information that we've learned today, I think that the question remains, what can we do to improve the VRS system, and who should be taking action on these issues? I'm going to take a second if folks could share the slides on this. And I will take a minute to make sure that that's visible and working for folks. Looking good. Okay, great. So as we mentioned, both the FCC plays an important role, and we're calling both PESP created a list of action items in the end of our report, and the ASL Interpreters Union also has a list of things that need to happen in order to resolve this crisis, which you can find on their website. But to summarize those things briefly for the purposes here, we believe the FCC should meet with the ASL Interpreters Union and enforce current regulations or implement new regulations on VRS providers that improve the service by meeting the goals of interpreters and ending a national interpreter shortage that is really plaguing VRS. Go to the next slide. while you're doing that, we're also calling on the VRS providers and their private equity owners to meet with the ASL union, interpreters union, and agree to remain neutral to ensure that interpreters have the right to organize without fear of intimidation or retaliation, type that workers have reported out of Purple and ZP Better Together in the past. Those interpreters, are looking to collectively bargain to improve staff retention through a number of improvements, such as increased wages that are more transparent, benefits, breaks, more training and mentorship, real deaf community input into the business, hiring of certified deaf interpreters, and better staffing that will lead to less wait time for users, as well as additional support for trilingual and other types of interpreters. And specifically with the issues that Joe raised earlier, we're calling on ZP Better Together and Kinderhook and Carlisle to ensure that the call centers that were closed are reopened and that former employees are rehired, as well as a commitment to avoid withdraw and avoid future use of forced arbitration agreements, which was another issue flagged before the closings.
Hey, Justin, I see a chat message that says we can't see the interpreter now that the slides are raised. Can we make sure that?
Okay, sure. Why don't we remove the slides? We want to make sure that everybody's able to see the interpreter first and foremost.
Oh, the person said it had been resolved. Sorry.
No problem. Yeah, so the final thing that that we're asking is for investors who invest in the private equity owners of these two companies, particularly Blackstone, Ariel, Kinderhook, and Carlisle and AlpInvest, should also meet with interpreters to learn more about the situation at these two firms, should inquire with these asset managers about their labor standards generally and how they're being applied at these particular companies, and then should review this information against their internal investment policies to evaluate any fiduciary risks that could be caused if these issues are not addressed in a timely manner. So those are the main things that interpreters are asking for. And so before we move into the Q&A period, I did want to just give the opportunity to any of the speakers if you do have any other things to add or anything that came to mind as we got through this discussion. Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow along with Dr. Shea. She had brought up kind of the quality of interpreters that are available. And one of the things that we notice when we have good interpreters who are skilled and trained in certain areas, but also having DIs with them, there are certain situations where we see that becoming really important. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize some of those areas. One of them is in mental health. Mental health is something that is really hard to diagnose for a hearing person to diagnose another hearing person. So if you are adding on cultural barriers, you're adding on language barriers, that becomes even more difficult. And that is still a call that happens a lot within the VRS space. I would echo that legal is another area that is really difficult to interpret, even if you know the jargon. So having DIs, deaf interpreters, would be something that would be hugely beneficial. And I would just like to applaud that note.
This is Dr. Shea. Yeah, and I wanted to follow up about the point on training. If we had more mentors who are deaf and part of the training process for interpreters, a newer interpreter would then be able to thrive. If we have training that's rooted in the deaf community, this could be a solution to that. But since we've seen private equity buy out these companies, We've seen training be reduced to a simple 2-week onboarding process, whereas in the past, training was more robust. There used to be 6-week training programs with deaf educators who were a part of the process and training these newer interpreters. But currently, there are not deaf educators a part of the process. Instead, we have hearing trainers training hearing people. And this is not what things used to be like, and it doesn't lead to the same outcomes. So this is a necessary part of our union and why we're advocating to push back against these companies for better training, basic training, and seeing these things be improved from these 2-week minimums to something better.
Thanks for that. Those are very important points. So before we, so we have, as I mentioned earlier, there is a Q&A here in the Zoom, and folks are welcome to use it to ask some questions. We did have one that is a comment that I think is an important thing to flag. So I'm just going to read this comment from the chat, which is that the chief legal officer for ZP Better Together is an attorney and former chief of the FCC Disability Rights Office who oversees the TRS. Very important always to think about sort of revolving door between industry and government. But it also brings another question on the FCC, which maybe could be answered by any of the panelists. Is there a process to make complaints about service, and can anybody speak to whether they've used that process before?
This is Dr. Shea. Yes, there is a grievance process in place. However, it is not a transparent process by any stretch. Additionally, it's not a process that I feel heard in as a consumer of the service. I have filed complaints directly with these providers like Sorensen about interpreters when things have happened in different calls, and the response has been, "Thank you for your feedback." Full stop. There's little to no resolution on these issues at all.
Thank you, Dr. Shea. It's hard to hear about that. One of the things that we identified when we wrote the report was both that the information about complaints is often not public, and the industry has been able to make a successful legal argument that the basic information about number of complaints and a lot of the details that would be helpful, I think, for advocates to know and to be able to advocate for improvements is classified as a trade secret, and so there is very little transparency into those complaints. Although we did do a Freedom of Information Act request that that gave us some information, but highly redacted. And so that's definitely another issue.
Yeah, no, I get it. I do. Unfortunately, as a consumer of the service, there is no resolution given for complaints a lot of the time. If we have a problem, be it about technology, be it about the interpreter, we get the same response time and time again. Thank you for your comment.
Yeah, so we actually have a question that's actually a comment, and I'm actually not sure I'm going to ask our ops people if it's possible. So Megan McGeary, who is an interpreter, has just offered to make a comment to speak on the internal Sorensen complaint process. And so if that is possible for us to allow her to speak on to the full group, love to try to do that. While we try to figure out that technical issue,
Justin, I'm going to
yes.
interrupt
Oh,
you.
great,
Sorry, this is Megan McGarry. My audio has been enabled, so
amazing, great.
happy to step in. Cool. Thank you for the interpreters. Just want to make sure you're good. You can hear me. Awesome. So I was in a position for about 3 years that was called a lead video interpreter. And during that time, I personally handled, we called it customer feedback from for video interpreters in VRS. And what that looks like is that we have an internal quality assurance department who processes complaints and compliments that are given directly on the Sorensen side of things. So either an email or a video call message. This quality assurance department then filters out who the compliment or complaint is for using the interpreter's ID number. And it is directed to it's then sent to the director of that interpreter. Once we had a lead video interpreter position, that became one of the duties of the lead VIs. So I processed lots of these in my 3 years in that position. And recently, within this year, it now has become a requirement for all Sorensen complaints to be addressed with the interpreter, as well as documented internally. So that is something that Sorensen does keep track of. However, as to the level of severity in the complaint, that is kind of dependent upon the director. So most times there's no actual discipline. What it is it's a refresher training opportunity. So we talk about what applicable compliance by the FCC needs to be addressed, as well as company policy. So that's how Sorensen deals with complaints. They call them customer feedback. But just wanted to kind of give some additional background on that.
Yeah.
They are kept in a file. I have no idea where that file is for a rolling 12 months.
Okay, interesting. That was going to be my next question, which was, those are obviously not made public, but how public within the company for interpreters and other employees.
Yes, it's just shared with the interpreter and the team, like the director and the leads. That's all that it's shared with. It's not shared with the full team of interpreters or anywhere public within the company or the general public.
Thanks for that additional information. You may want to stick around because you may have a good answer to this next question, which is what consideration is there for interpreters to have certifications or membership with RID, which is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf? And is there a code of professional conduct to follow or ethical practices system to field complaints? Was the question. Feels like a lot, but just given that, if any of the interpreters have any thoughts on either certifications or codes of professional conduct or practices fielding complaints. I see Meg.
I can try to take a stab at this. I'm not sure I understand the question correctly, but I know that Sorensen itself has a $1,000 stipend for professional development for full-time employees and a $500 stipend for part-time employees. But if we're talking about the code of ethics, I wouldn't say that my ethics are on me as an interpreter. But there's no ethics for Sorensen. They don't have to follow a code of ethics. So I would again advocate, this is why we are very much pro-union. I'm seeing the harm that is being done by these situations that our interpreters are being put in, that there's no way to handle these situations. And so we're asking the company for support to do these things. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to think about. Yeah, the code of ethics affects interpreters who are doing the interpreting, but it doesn't seem to reach beyond the background and the working conditions and all the issues that might make it difficult for somebody to meet their professional obligations. Thanks for that. Yeah, so Megan, you just wrote that in the chat. Would you like to say what you just what you just wrote here?
Just confirming that it is not, from a company perspective, it is not the code of ethics that are the guiding factor. It depends on who you speak to within the company. So as I was addressing customer feedback, I would always try to pull back into code of ethics because I'm an interpreter. But from a company perspective, it's about compliance with the FCC and company policy compliance. They are not beholden to the code of ethics.
Thanks for sharing that. So right now we have no additional other questions. If anybody had anything else they want to add in these last few minutes before we wrap up.
Yeah, I did want to speak briefly about the certification process, if that's all right. So, first of all, there more than one agency does certify interpreters. There are a few agencies out there that do certify interpreters. So I'm talking about the BEI. There's an organization called CASLI and RID. So there are a few interpreter certification bodies out there. Currently, I would say that the setup in terms of certification is dependent on the company. So there are some states that require RID certification, but other states don't have legislation that requires certification to work as an interpreter. So that means there's a clear inconsistency in the certification process when it comes to hiring an interpreter. So you may be BEI certified, but the state requires RID certification, meaning that the interpreter won't be able to be hired. So this is a big inconsistency that we see state to state. There's also, a very important note here that I want to make, that interpreter certification does not necessarily mean that they're qualified to do this work. So it is a minimum standard when we're talking about certification and interpreting. I am personally not a certified interpreter. I do have interpreter training, and my training did comply with the RID code of ethics. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm not a certified deaf interpreter, and I've never been certified. And I won't personally be certified through the RID. That's a choice of mine, because they are an audit organization. So oftentimes, interpreters who work at Sorensen or ZP may be qualified to do the work, but they don't meet the certification process. So they may not be certified, they may not have a state certification, and that certification that they may have may not be recognized by the provider that they're hired at. So there's a lot of variability here across providers and states. So we do need to advocate for more consistency in terms of company policy. And this is something that the union could play a role in setting a standard for certification. if the companies do choose to require certification, we should have them accept all certifications that are available to interpreters. We shouldn't be relying on one certification, say from the RID, but we should be accepting all certifications for interpreters. And I think that this is something that the union could advocate for as a part of their demands or in the negotiation contract by saying what kind of certification should be accepted and that certified interpreters could be used.
Right, thanks for that additional clarification. I think we're gonna close out here. I want to thank all of the panelists for the work they're doing and for their time with us today. And again, a special thanks to the interpreters who joined us to make sure this was an accessible webinar. And we will be following up with everybody who registered with some additional information and links after the webinar. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully you'll be digging into that report and learning more about this important issue going forward.